Engaging rural places on social justice and rural education. In this short overview, I'm going to make some comments on the 2013 paper published with Bill Green. This paper was part of a special edition in Qualitative Inquiry. The edition had a number of very useful and interesting papers on space, place and social justice, and I would recommend the whole edition to people that are interested in exploring this topic. Our paper was influenced by a couple of thoughts. The first one was the idea of enlarging social justice, that we need to get beyond the simple distributive, recognitive and representative approaches that have not historically made an impact on rural educational disadvantage. They're often the focus of policies and debate, but if we look at rural education since we've nearly had records, there's been no major changes. A couple of influential things were the Green on Let's paper of 2007 about needing to problematise space in relation to equity in rural education, Soja's work published since then on spatial justice, and Bourdieu's ideas. It's very much influenced by Bourdieuian notions, particularly that idea that people's lives happen in physical and social spaces connected with cultural and symbolic capital. There are a couple of propositions that the paper turns on. The first is, again, learning from Bourdieu, that we perhaps need to focus on the issues rather than the methods of study. We want to get a little bit away from the debates over method, while at the same time this paper is somewhat about method in order to achieve that. Drawing on Duffy here, Duffy's qualitative interview, but noting that numbers are compelling in rural education research and education policy, and that can be an issue. Rural meanings, though, according to Howley, Theobald and Holy in that seminal paper, are an essential component of rural education research. But we often wonder if we do see research about rural meanings. Perhaps we don't. So in this paper we are arguing then that rural education research needs to learn from Soja's spatial justice piece about how the rural is constructed. Now, we should be familiar with a number of the approaches to rurality, and that idea that there is no one rural. Okay, there are many different constructions. I've cited here Cloke's argument around the social, political and functional ideas of rurality. Soja's notion around spatiality is a third way of understanding the world, which gets away from dominant historical and social perspectives. So that notion that can often be used in modernity type studies, that the rural is historically produced by the move to modernity or social circumstance. Well, no, they are historical. There is also another way involved here. That's spatiality. And there are also arguments around the emphasis on place. That's important in rural studies. If you look at a lot of the rural-focused work, it's about rural places as being specific and meaningful. But how do we actually achieve that then in our research studies? Why are we focused on rural? Well, again, the multiplicity of rurality is important here. We are familiar with the various constructions that of the rural as competing, contested and constructed. Now, that draws on or relates to a lot of the work on place and situated practice. A lot of rural research in the last 10 years has been talking about place and situated practice. If we take the critical pedagogy of place of Grunwald, or Greenwood now, you've got the notion of examining the influence of established and powerful methods. Okay, so how does power construct the rural? What's the relationship between centres and peripheries, as described by Neffswar? Place, again, important. We talk about the idea, I like Guerin's notion here, that place is space filled up by people, practices, objects and representations. And there's those three notions of the geographic location, material form, and meaning. We've got the Donhauer, Hogan, Shell definition that's often cited now in rural studies around defining the rural both in quantitative statistics, geographically and culturally. So this idea of the rural is more than just one construction. And then we could draw a whole range of rural examples here that draw the social, the statistical or the geographical or locational. Okay, actually this complexity of the rural, that the rural is debated, contested, that is critical for where this paper wants to suggest that we go. Importantly, if we focus, or if we look at each one of these approaches, if we define the rural quantitatively, it implies a certain approach to research that is quantitative. If we want to look at the rural as geographic, it implies a certain methodology. If we think rural is cultural, it implies another methodology across the quantitative spectrum. So how do we actually then research the rural in a way that values the rural meanings and represents the rural in its multiplicity of forms? That's the problem that we've got. And this is where Bourdieu perhaps comes back in. That Bourdieu preaches and practices a form of what we might call methodological polytheism. So in his work, he would deploy a range of techniques to best suit the question at hand. He wasn't stuck with one tool in his methodological tool belt. He had multiple tools depending on the problem in front of him. And I think that's the insight for rural education studies. So what we then sought to do here was bring together the idea of SOJA, spatiality, spatial justice, and Bourdieu to see what happens when we put them in conversation with space, place, and social justice. When we aim to value the particularities and subjectivities of rural places. They are what makes the rural unique. And the concern that we had then is when we do rural research, we can often erase some of the very things that make it rural because we are constrained by our methodology or we are constrained by the need to have a certain policy impact. So basically then, this multiplicity of rurality cuts across disciplinary and meta-methodological boundaries. That creates research problems. But any research that's informed by only one of these paradigms or epistemological positions will only ever represent part of the issue of rurality. So the way forward that we proposed in the study was the idea of strategic eclecticism. And that is, given the complexity of the rural, representing it in its own terms as part of the ethical work that we need to do, and working from what I've described previously as a rural standpoint, we can see that the methodological stances that we have historically are inadequate. So strategic eclecticism is basically about saying, well, we need to work within that trialectic, which means it's not just mixed methods, because part of the paper we actually question if mixed methods actually exist, if they really work, but it's about multiple intersecting scales, unique power relationships, and that trialectic, and using the various methodological tools that we have in front of us to represent and reproduce the various understandings of rurality that we have, and putting them all in conversation. So yes, it's a mixed method type approach, but we're trying to get beyond the language of mixed method, which tends to be deployed as a, we'll do some qualitative work, add some survey data to it, and then present them together without them really engaging with each other. The other key point here is rural education research can learn from Bourdieu and focus on the specificality of rural issues rather than the methods. The final point that all this rests upon is a lot of our methodologies are informed by metronormative notions of research and policy impact. That is, they represent a metropolitan norm. When we look at statistically rural education advantage and disadvantage, that advantage and disadvantage is measured in comparison to students elsewhere who tend to be the majority. So by virtue of being a majority, they define the norm. So we are always within a comparison. And we need to get away from that comparison, which is why valuing rural meanings, thinking about those in a methodological approach, is so important. And in this paper, we've tried to say that that is part of the social justice imperative that we have as researchers.